Black Panther Wakanda Forever is our occasion to get together today. Also, welcome to those of you watching on the live stream on YouTube, current students and alumni. If you're here with us, there's popcorn and water if you'd like to have some sustenance. So I'm Jean-Christophe Cloutier, the undergraduate chair of English here at Penn, and I'll be your moderator this evening. So I'm excited for this roundtable. I'm so thankful for all three of you for accepting my invitation to make this event possible and to contribute to this event. I also want to give some thanks to people who made this possible. So the Cinema and Media Studies program, the Center for Africana Studies, and the good people at the New Student Orientation and Academic Initiatives. So without your help, we could not have provided this experience. We could not have bought out 2 auditoriums for students to get free tickets to see the movie 2 weeks ago. So English is very appreciative of your generous collaboration. So winter reading project's a long-standing tradition at Penn. And I said reading, and it's like a winter watching project. But this was, a consensus, a choice to make to get people excited and have a greater cross-campus collaboration with cinema, with Center for Africana Studies and all that. So we're thankful to make this happen tonight. I also want to thank the SAS and Multimedia Services for giving the time, the expertise, and the equipment to making this live stream possible. Thanks also to the Alumni Office for joining us in this initiative and making sure that our cherished alumni can participate in some fashion. Thank you to our host, the Gutman College House, and Nikita Thomas for giving us this wonderful venue here. I want to thank the UAB, the Undergraduate Advisory Board, for helping us with the event from conception to actualization. Professor Tony Bowers, and of course, a huge thanks has to go to our wonderful Associate Director of Undergraduate Studies, Becky Friedman, over here, please, who's done so much. So in MCU speak, she's the Pepper Potts to head English and Starch Industries. If you can try that. So I also want to thank our esteemed panelists, Professor Dagmawi Woubshet, Professor Peter Hollywood Decherney, and Maestro Arianna James, our own assembled Avengers here on the panel, for agreeing to be our panelists on Black Panther Wakanda Forever, directed by Brian Trudeau. So before formally introducing the panelists, I just want to share a few opening remarks. As moderator, but also as a teacher of comics here at Penn. So when I was a kid, even by the time I was an undergraduate in Montreal, Quebec, the very idea that there would be a full-fledged Marvel cinematic universe was so far from a real possibility that it's uncanny for me to think about this moment. And not only am I moderating a panel on Black Panther 2, as in it's like a sequel, it's already Black Panther 1, but that it's also the final film in phase 4 of the MCU. That might not track for everybody, but yeah, this is the end of phase 4. And now we're going to start phase 5 already. Just unthinkable for myself and my high school friends, right? Like we had our little pull lists of comics, right? We would talk about it passionately and seriously. We were not the most popular gang in high school, but the friends that I made there are still my close friends to this day. I feel that Marvel comics specifically have been a constant companion for me since early childhood. I would read them in French with my sister, who collected Dark Phoenix and Kitty Pryde X-Men comics, and Storm comics, all the strong women superheroes. And then I started reading the English ones when I started around 10 years old. It's actually how I learned a lot of the language. My favorite was Wolverine because he was short, he was Canadian, and he had gray hair. So anyway, comics are dear to me, right, as a form, but also the superhero genre has been formative since an early age. And I know we're discussing the film this evening, but it's thanks in part to the success of the MCU suite of movies that comics and the superhero genre has gained such traction, even in the academy. It's too powerful a cultural force to ignore, even for stuffy academics. Not that any of us are stuffy. And I've been lucky enough to teach comics at the university for over a decade. And I always try to include at least one superhero narrative in there to show the versatility of the form. And as teachers, it's never been easier or more accessible. Now we have even this just came out this year, Penguin Classics. Penguin Classics has released reprints of early superhero Black Panther. There's a Spider-Man one, I think a Captain America one. So again, right, the idea that paper plastics is releasing it, making it easier for us to order them as textbooks to teach my classes is really kind of wonderful. And it's great also for me because all of what was once useless data and factoids in my brain can be used for teaching and using the classroom as a space to try to understand what kind of work do superhero narratives do for us. What do these speculative worlds reflect in terms of our very real fantasies, our fears, our histories, our hopes, our visions for being together in a hostile world? And I feel that there's a weight of responsibility that lies upon Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, and Black Panther franchise as a whole, a little bit heavier than most superheroes due to the character's symbolic viewpoint. The film is proving to be a big box office success, and though it's not as universally beloved in its critical reception as the first, it's still vastly celebrated in most news outlets. It's an unusual sequel in that it had to do a massive about-face in pre-production when Chadwick Boseman, the lead actor playing T'Challa of Black Panther, passed away in 2020. The sequel then had to face that loss directly and find the hinge upon which the continuity of Black Panther would return. In many ways, this was a test for the superhero movie genre. Just as the first one was a test in, can an all-black superhero movie be a hit? And the answer was a resounding yes from across the globe. Wakanda Forever, the test became how to move forward without the king, with the death of an icon, but also, can a superhero movie be an authentic vehicle for mourning, grief, loss, especially in terms of Black death, the loss of young Black men, right? Or do its generic tropes and constraints make it too reductive for a genuine effort? Is it doomed to become heavy-handed in its delivery? Or can a blockbuster resonate even more powerfully thanks to the epic scale of its effects and global reach? That's only one way in which we can interrogate and unpack the film. We can also ask, what kinds of Blackness does the film present to us? Whose version of Africanness are we witnessing? And thanks to the reinvention of Namor, the Submariner, as Namor, right? As an ancient indigenous Mesoamerican mutant, what kinds of Americanness are being represented here? What are the affordances of science fiction, superhero, Afrofuturist narratives? What is gained, what is lost by being part of the MCU global marketing machine? What is this film's status in the context of today's industry? Right? Is it just one more planned installment in phase 4 of a studio's long-term investment plan? Or is it a shining monad shucking away the demands of capitalism in favor of an artist's vision? But also, what's up with the accents? And why does Ironheart look like a Power Ranger? What about those green trunks? So these are only some of the questions that our panelists are going to be addressing today. Their remarks. So without further ado, I'm going to stop being windbag man and introduce to you our distinguished speakers this evening. So I'll introduce them. They're each going to speak in turn. We'll have a discussion, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. Dagmawi Woubshet is the Ahuja Family Presidential Associate Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, a scholar of African American literature and art. He works at the intersections of African American, LGBTQIA+, and African studies. He is the author of The Calendar of Loss, Race, Sexuality, and Mourning in the Early Era of AIDS. And he co-edited the volume Ethiopia, Literature, Art, and Culture, special issue of Kalaloo. His essays have appeared in Transition, NKA, Journal of Contemporary African Art, and The Atlantic, among other publications. Woubshet is a recipient of several fellowships, including from Civitella Ranieri, the Africa Institute in Sharjah, and the Modern Art Museum in Addis Ababa, where he curated Julie Meretu, the Addis Show. Arianna James is a fourth-year PhD student in the English department of Penn, where she received an MA in 2020. She graduated summa cum laude with a BA English Literature and Chinese Language and Literature from Macaulay Honors at Hunter College in 2018. Her research collapses the often disparate fields of African American and Asian American literature and theory together. Outside of Afro-Asian studies, Arianna's other research and teaching interests include theories of mixedness, queerness, film, speculative fiction, and fan art. But what this doesn't say is that Ari is to Penn English what Riri Williams Ironheart is to MIT. So our own resident genius with a secret warehouse lab of mine. Peter Decherney is professor of cinema and media studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His 7 books include Hollywood's Copyright Wars from Edison to the Internet and Hollywood, a very short introduction. He is also an award-winning filmmaker. Most recently, he co-directed the Discovery Plus original documentary, Dreaming of Jerusalem, and the virtual reality docu-series, The Heart of Puerto Rico. His first book of photography, Endless Exodus, A Jewish Experience in Ethiopia, is forthcoming. Can't wait to see it. Professor Decherney has been an Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences scholar, a fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, and a U.S. State Department Arts envoy to Myanmar. He is an award-winning teacher whose open online course on history of Hollywood has enrolled over 70,000 learners. So please join me in welcoming him.
ጤና ይስጥልኝ እንደምናመሻችሁ በዋካንዳ ወይም ቆሳ ባልናገርም አማርኛ ስለምናገር ትንሽ የአፍሪካ ቋንቋ እንድትሰሙ ነው። I said, good evening. So I don't speak Wakanda or Kosa, but at least an African language. Flexing a bit, but it is the soundtrack of the film, so I thought we'd bring that also into the conversation. First and foremost, I want to thank JC and Becky for just extraordinary work that you've done in staging this conversation, but also the screening. Right? So just the creative way you've done it, including a flag poster that you created. So thank you so much. Okay, and last but not least, a great pleasure to be in conversation with Ari and Peter. I'm going to begin with an anecdote. That's framed my initial impressions of Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. So the first time I saw the film was exactly a week ago in Rome with my friend Margot, who is sitting here. That is Professor Margot Crawford, who's also the chair of our English department. So showtime was at 9:15. And naturally, we had a long day exploring Rome, and we decided to get dinner beforehand. We're having a lovely time at dinner, wonderful conversation, delicious food, great wine, and I like digestives after a meal, so I was sipping on a few Amaro and realized our showtime was fast approaching. So we rush out of the restaurant, and from a distance I see a cab and began waving my hand frantically, trying to hail it from the sidewalk. Of course, Professor Crawford pulls out a superhero move of her own, gets in the middle of the road, stops the cab with a gesture, and off we go to Cinema Barberini. Now, as I said, the start time was at 9:15. We arrive around 9:25, expecting like American movie-going experience, that we have just endless trailers, advertising, and things wouldn't start, 20 to 30 minutes after start time. We grab our tickets and are told to head upstairs to Theater 6, as printed on our tickets, where Black Panther is showing. We get there and we realize quickly an error, because by the door, advertising showing, the poster showing the film was Bones and All. We quickly dip in just to make sure, and indeed it turns out to be another film. We rush back downstairs, alert the usher of the problem, apologizes, tells us it was a printing error on the tickets, guides us to Theater 3 on the first floor. So again, we rush into the nearly empty theater, only 2 other people were there, and quickly, sat down. It's paid $9.35 at this point. Well past previews. And we expect the movie to have started, maybe by a few minutes. But once again, we are uncertain if what's on the screen in Theater 3 is in fact Black Panther Wakanda Forever, because the scene we were watching seemed so divergent, more aptly put, so divorced from our expectation of Wakanda Forever. So within a few seconds, we shoot up again thinking it's the wrong film. Everybody in this particular scene was white. And overall, it felt like some generic American kind of Navy SEALs flick or maritime action thriller, right? So if you've seen this film, it means we missed the beginning, the burial scene. You get another scene, and we thought this is the preamble of the film, right? The cast of white characters.
It's like the attack of the Tolokans.
Exactly, they're on the Atlantic Ocean, exactly, yes. And so we get up again and aim for the exit, and as we are leaving in hushed voices, we are asking each other, this can't be Black Panther, is it Black Panther? And just as we were about to hit the door, someone mentions vibrating. We pause, right? It's still somewhat doubtful, and then we're being attacked by the Wakandans. And then, of course, we realize, yes, indeed, this time we are in the right theater. And we return and watch the rest of the film. So I lead with this anecdote for a reason. In part because one of the main differences that I found between Black Panthers 1 and 2 is the ways in which the sequel tries, in spite of the constraints of a superhero film, a Marvel film, a Hollywood blockbuster, in spite of all of those constraints, the ways in which it tried to divest itself of what Toni Morrison calls the white gaze, right? Operative term here is tries. Right, of course, because it is a Marvel film, it's a big franchise film with clear commercial interests, it's not an independent film, right? It's designed to make heaps of money. But that's it. At least for me, it tries in a deliberate way to work outside the confines of these expectations, film expectations shaped by the white gaze. So with the exception of this sequence early in the film, which I found disorienting, and other scenes that involve the CIA character Everett Ross, and then his boss, played by Julia Louis-Dreyfus, minor scenes, I found the displacement of white characters to be a very notable shift in this sequel than the first, but more notable was the reworking of a major conceit of the first film, which was the kind of liaison solidarity between the Kingdom of Wakanda and the CIA. That made the first film at once a kind of Black, speculative film and an American imperial thriller, right? So the sequel as a whole, it decenters whiteness, if you will, and one way it achieves this is by advancing a different set of antagonisms that we rarely see on the big screen, which is between Black and Indigenous peoples, right? So Black and white, since we've had Birth of a Nation, modern American cinema, that antagonism is such a productive white-black, that binary, or white and other. So albeit fictional between Wakanda, the African civilization, and Tolokan, the Mayan civilization, it shifts the tenor, especially in the second half of the film for me, by simply taking whiteness out of the picture, if you will. We enter a different interracial, right, Black Native calculus, and a Black point of view that's unencumbered by or somewhat unencumbered by the white gaze. And remember, as Toni Morrison says, quote, if you took the gaze of the white male, or even the white female, but certainly the male, out of the world, it was freedom. She's talking about her own literary enterprise, right? She said you could think anything, go anywhere, imagine anything. There was no longer the problem of looking through the master's gaze. Right? Now, by at least trying to relinquish the white gaze, Wakanda Forever differs from its precursor in important ways. Reviewing Black Panther, the first one, in the online platform Africa is a Country, a friend and former colleague, Russell Rickford, who's a professor at Africana Studies at Cornell University, wrote a brilliant review and a somewhat scathing review of the first one. And he says, quote, anyone committed to an expansive concept of Pan-African liberation must regard the first one, Black Panther, as a counter-revolutionary film. And he says, though, because he says the film relies on these predictable tropes, 3 different tropes. One is African and African-American estrangement, if you recall the first film, right? Killmonger and T'Challa, in ways that just eclipse the complex, capacious relationship between continental Africans and Africans in the diaspora, but specifically African Americans, right? Over centuries. That film has a very reductive take. The other trope is African American pathology. If you remember, it kind of sets up African virtue against African American vice. Oakland is kind of this dejected space, not when we think about Oakland and Black Panther Party, right? It's a site of revolutionary possibility, right? And then he says the last trope is the white savior complex, and that's the CIA character featured so prominently in the first film, right? And again, watching the first film, because I saw it with everybody's excitement in a packed house. I can't lie, I was dressed up. I was one of those people. I was caught up, right, in the phenomenon of watching this speculative film in relief of people who look like me and Black people, right? And did not necessarily have my critical eye. Now, watching it yesterday, I thought that liaison, that partnership with the CIA and the Republic of Wakanda, in a very uncritical way, was so just, kind of notoriously rendered, uncritically rendered. And I don't know about you all, I don't want the CIA to underwrite my utopia, or any Black utopia for that matter, right? But this is the kind of revision of this new sequel, even the CIA. It's a disaffected CIA agent and not the CIA that is in partnership with the Kingdom of Wakanda. So all this to say, I'm going to wrap up. These tropes of African and African-American estrangement, African-American pathology, and the kind of white savior, complex, or figure, whatever. These tropes are really undergirded by, more broadly, the white gaze, and also what Toni Morrison calls American Africanism. It's called the fetishization of color, the transference to Blackness of the power of illicit sexuality, chaos, madness, impropriety, anarchy, strangeness, and helpless, hapless desire. I think of Killmonger's character in that way. I don't want to exaggerate the achievements of this new sequel, but at least I think, given the success of that first film, there will, in the way that the superhero genre, and especially the first film, was just a hodgepodge of genre. You get your Bond-born sequence, you get your sci-fi sequence, you get it was a hodgepodge of these different conventions. And this one, I felt, was actually more of a balanced medley, if you will. It wasn't after 2 minutes, it's a scene in genre, a change in genre. And I think given the success, maybe he had a different license, freedom to experiment and not meet the expectation of a Hollywood audience or the Hollywood machinery that maybe didn't expect, right, a Black film to be as successful. Given its success, I think it gives it a different kind of maneuver. And we know, as I said, one of the tropes is this threadbare representation of Black Americans that Hollywood exploits, and I think he divorces Black and white characters, by the way, right? He kind of distances himself from that project. Well, much more to be said, but for now, I'll pause it.
Thank you.
I guess it's my turn. Oh, thank you.
Use the other mic.
The other mic. That was the button. Okay. Yeah, it's so great to be here. Thank you, JC, for inviting me. Thank you, Becky, for helping set all this up. Thank you, Dag and Pierre, for being in conversation with me. What I love more than watching films is talking about them and thinking about them. So this is my bread and butter, and I'm so excited. Yeah, and thank you so much for that, Jag, as well. When I came out, I went to I went to one of those screenings, but I went to the screening with the students, and it was so great to be in that space with students who presumably know more about Marvel than I do, because I'm not really a big Marvel head. But I watched the first one and I loved it when it came out, also in theater. Didn't dress up, but loved it a lot. Yeah, and what struck me watching Black Panther: Wakanda Forever was the Afrofuturist promises that were made in the film, and how some of those, perhaps because of the Hollywood machine that Dak talked about, perhaps because of the giant Marvel franchise itself, and what's at stake there would, of course, be, people in seats and profits. Maybe those are the reasons why some of those promises are maybe broken. Some of the more subversive, revolutionary, radical aspects of Afrofuturism kind of lose their teeth somehow in Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. And for those who don't know, Afrofuturism is a term itself coined by Mark Derry in 1994, and it gestures at an African diasporic imagining that pulls layers of history into the speculative future, right? So we get a blending of Black aesthetics, traditions, and science fiction all together. So some examples of that are Octavia Butler's, of course, Kindred, for example, Tomi Adeyemi, who does Children of Blood and Bone, and we've got Akweghị Emezi, who does Pet, and of course also Nnedi Okorafor, who does the Vinci trilogy. And I didn't know this, JC, but apparently she wrote the 2019 comic of Shuri, Search for the Black Panther too. So yeah, Afrofuturism and Black Panther, they're kind of, Black Panther of Afrofuturism, right, is in that genre. And so my personal favorite moment of the film, and it's small, but I think it also tells you, will hint at my thoughts of the film, but my favorite moment of the film was definitely kind of the crystallization of Afrofuturism brought to life for me, which is the moment when Okoye pilots the craft into Wakanda and we see the shields kind of disappear, and she is beating on this kind of steering device, we don't know, but it's water, and we see the reverberations of the water as she beats out these movements, and the drum beat kicks up, and the camera zooms in, and we see Wakanda for the first time, right? And she says something like, "Welcome home." And it does feel so much like being able to be there, right? To feel it. And that moment to me kind of crystallizes the best parts of Black Panther and the best parts of the second movie as well, is seeing Afrofuturism kind of brought to life on screen, seeing these dreams made lush and real, and to discover not only what Wakanda looks like, but what it possibly smells like, what it sounds like, what it feels like to be there, right? I think that is where these films completely thrive. And the portrayal of these dreams, of course, inherently requires so much money with the CGI and the cinematography, and you've got countless hands working on these projects, right? We've got endless moving parts. And what I couldn't stop talking or thinking about really is how, like, in these big projects, like Wakanda Forever, how the promise of Afrofuturism and Afrofuturism's different promises that are kind of hinted at in Black Panther the radical and revolutionary aspects of it inevitably get caught up in this industry undertone, right? It gets subverted, the teeth get taken away. And one example of this would be from a different universe would be Lovecraft Country, and HBO canceled the second season because the studio and the writers couldn't really see eye to eye on the plot of the second season. And so one example I wanted to talk through about this kind of undercutting that happens in the film is how some of the terminology and themes that are inherently just part of the Afrofuturist landscape is kind of robbed of power in Wakanda Forever. So, for example, when Shuri kind of calls Martin Freeman's character her favorite colonizer like multiple times throughout the film, I think the first time it was funny, and I think in a good way it naturalizes these terms, right? I think in that way that's a good thing. But we then get a scene later, which is the contrast of it is kind of shocking, and I think it's in a conversation between Shuri and Okoye, where Talokan is specifically described as their empire under the water, and someone else responds it's beautiful, and I think Shuri was the one who responds that it's beautiful. And the word empire here is so divorced from the idea of colonialism, from imperialism, from what empire means, right? And it becomes entirely separate from the term colonizer, and when in fact they're very much connected, right? So on one hand, you get something that's kind of used as a joke that gestures at all these histories, and on the other hand, the term empire not being used in the same capacity as like colonizers used, right? And so I know we see that like sequels tend to go bigger, and I think we very much see that here in Wakanda Forever. In the first movie, we get Killmonger, and we're kind of told right away the kind of antagonist of him, right? We see what character he is when he kills his partner, another Black woman after stealing that from the museum. I think they're in London. And so in that moment, we kind of understand that his character and his villainy we're supposed to see it as something inevitable, right? We're supposed to see it as something that he was made from historical circumstances and born to material conditions that have almost nurtured in him a kind of vengeful colonial impulse to conquer, right? So in that moment, we see what character and what villain he is. And in Wakanda Forever, we see a similar story, but bigger. We see this kind of same colonial impulse and this vengeance applied not to just one character, but a whole group of people. To not only Namor, but all of the Talokans. We get flashbacks of Namor as a child, of enslaved indigenous folks, and the non-diegetic sounds in Wakanda Forever especially work overtime to ensure the audience knows that Namor is a villain. In the flashback that we cut to quite a few times, we see him as a child, and we see him fighting back against the slavers, the colonizers. And I think that moment is supposed to be, or I suppose is shown to be, his villainous origin story, right? Everything is in flames. And he's even named in that moment, what we call him for the rest of the film, which is Namor. And the portrayal of the Talokans of Namor has been something that I've been mulling over for a while now, and I would love to hear what other folks think as well. For me, I kept thinking about the portrayal of indigeneity as something of the past, as something that has already passed and has to be dug up from the water. And of what happens when media repeatedly seals indigenous folks and people into and defines them by moments of colonization and violence. What happens then, right? What are we left with? And in the last moments of the first movie, Killmonger gets one of the, I think, defining lines of the film, where he says, "Just bury me in the ocean with my ancestors who jumped from the ships because they knew death was better than bondage." And when Wakanda Forever first started and we saw people begin to like pop out of the water in that strange like Navy SEAL scientist film that, are we sure it's Black Panther? We're not sure. In that scene, we see these people begin to pop up from the water, and we found out that it was vibranium at the bottom of the ocean. I thought they were going to play on that idea in the theme of grief, but also rebirth after Chadwick Boseman's death. And play with the idea of what happened to the enslaved folks who were not only buried at sea, but were thrown unwillingly into it. And it made me think of the novel The Deep, 2019, that was published in 2019 by River Solomon. and worked on by a whole bunch of people, which follows the idea of the descendants and children of the pregnant enslaved folks who were thrown off ships. And David Dix, who is Jefferson from Hamilton, worked on the project with Solomon, and he described the Jeep as a combination of Black Panthers, Wakanda, and Atlantis. And that is very much also the film that we watched for today. And so when that plot line didn't happen, I was like, okay, I've gotten bad at calling things. But when that didn't happen, I thought, okay, well, maybe the film was focused on a type of allyship, right? Or kinship against other powers trying to get the vibranium. And you kind of get that at the beginning of the film. And like when Ramonda shows up at the UN and like dumps on the French folks. Sorry, JC. That's what we get.
I'm not European.
And that didn't really happen either. And I was disappointed by how these threads of kind of possibilities weren't followed through. And instead became this pitting of brown and Black people against each other. And this idea that Blackness and indigeneity are in any way kind of in conflict. And I know full well, Dag mentions it, I'm sure Peter will go into more detail about, it's at the end of the day, it's a Marvel film. It's supposed to make money, it's supposed to fill seats. Quotas must be met and new characters must be shoehorned into the film. And there needs to be an abundance of action scenes, of fighting, and the simplification of these huge histories and concepts that the Black Panther films kind of choose to tackle, right, into something more digestible. However, the lush spectacle of hyper-militarism and Black and brown people fighting, killing each other, and dragging each other into the ocean, while conversely we have Martin Freeman and his ex-wife arguing in the kitchen. After the promises and dreams of Afrofuturism that have been made by Black Panther and the films in general, that polarization really stood out for me in my viewing. To that point, I thought the end tribute for Chadwick Boseman was beautiful, but I do think a lot of these ideas that I've brought up are crystallized for me most clearly at the beginning of the film. The Marvel logo, which usually is colorful and filled with comic book pages, and drawings of the characters we'll soon see brought to life, a kaleidoscope of all of Marvel's intellectual properties. In Wakanda Forever, as a tribute, there are snippets and shots of Chadwick Boseman in black and white instead, before they're eventually superimposed upon by the Marvel logo. And these moving images eventually still, with shots of Boseman confined within the logo and stuff. And while I think the editing was well done, I couldn't help but wonder again about capitalism as a sustaining impulse throughout all of Black Panther as well. There's such care there when an actor who embodied a character passes, and when a studio chooses to retire that character out of respect. I do believe that. But there's also the slippery slope between celebrating a full person who existed beyond his character and beyond his job as an actor, and sealing him in as almost another intellectual property of Marvel and Disney, the way Black Panther as a character is, right? And I think ultimately, I'll wrap up here, the projection of Western colonialist dreams of empire onto the Wakandans and the Talakans, the need to conquer and wage war, was the most glaring example of that industry undertow in the film. When Shuri says Wakanda Forever, the title of the film, before effectively immolating them more, moments after he says things could have been different, that really sums up to me how the movie fails to reach the heights of its Afrofuturist potential.
Thank you again, JC and Becky, for organizing this, and Billy for comments. Jag and Art, we'll talk a little more about that. Like Art, I'm not a big MCU head either. I'm always kind of disappointed by the references to other characters and films in place of an actual narrative. And all the emotion that's placed around the superheroes who died, you always know they come back in the next film. I know we couldn't have been surprised when T'Challa had a son named T'Challa. We'll continue on. So Wakanda Forever, draws on that prestige, as we heard, of African and Mesoamerican culture to create possibly a work, maybe failed work of Afrofuturism, to tell an anti-colonialist narrative, maybe also a failed anti-colonialist narrative. And of course, to feature a Black woman as a superhero. JC asked me to talk a little bit about the historical and industrial background of the film, and that's what I'm going to do. This is a Disney film, and so my question for you is, what does it mean for this film to be made by Disney, the biggest studio in the world. They had a bad quarter reading and the CEO resigned, but still the biggest studio in the world. So in a way, this is what Hollywood has always done. Big companies make movies that celebrate individual agency and revolutionaries who defeat corporate state empires, the ones they have. Somehow the status quo is always reaffirmed at the end. It's been said that Hollywood is the most transgressive cinema in the world if you log off the last 20 minutes of every movie. But maybe the best example of this kind of celebration of rebels is the Star Wars franchise, which of course Disney now also owns. And increasingly Star Wars tells us, maybe the truth, that rebels and the Empire are really just two sides of the same family. They're connected, they hate each other. This is kind of, as Herbert Marcuse and the Borg both tell us, this is for JC, right? Resistance is ultimately always futile. So Disney kind of co-opting and domesticating or celebrating and amplifying this anti-colonial message, and it doesn't matter. So a little Disney history to kind of give you the background. I think there are two parts to Disney's DNA. The first component is really about its existence as a corporation. It goes back to the very beginnings. So Walt Disney's first big success was Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Ultimately, in a dispute, he broke up with Universal, who owned Oswald, and he swore he would never not own his property again when it turned out that Universal owned it. Then he just changed the ears and tail a little bit, called it Mouse, and started Mickey Mouse. Of course, he hadn't created Oswald or Mickey Mouse. Ube Iwerks, Czech animator, had, and actually finally Disney gets Oswald back in the early 2000s. So we tend to think of Disney also as kind of this individual genius, but really that's also marketing. It was always a kind of corporation bent on ownership and expansion. We often think of it as a Disney product because we would see the Disney signature at the beginning of the film. It's actually a marketing artist who created that signature. It always frustrated Disney that he couldn't recreate it well. So he would walk around with little cards with a signature on it that he could hand out because he couldn't write his own signature as it was imagined. So Disney's always this kind of corporate empire from the beginning. To jump way ahead to the late 1960s, when every other film studio was bought by a multinational conglomerate, Disney just refused to be bought and became its own kind of octopus, buying up TV studios, like in stations like ABC. They built theme parks, they expanded into home video, and that's what turned Disney into a major studio. It had actually been a small studio before then. So it's this kind of octopus corporation. It's storytelling that also kind of similar, about competition, absorbing stories from other cultures, and then making them safer. So the early Disney series remade Grimm's fairy tales and other stories without violence and with happy endings. They specialized in princess fairy tales that had nimbly over time responded to cultural criticism, becoming more feminist over time, more racially and ethnically diverse. When Aladdin, just to take one example, was released and had a lot of criticism from Arab communities, they re-edited it for the home video releases. In fact, Disney has a long history of re-editing its films in response to criticism. And I think we've seen these strategies just combined over the past few decades as Disney just absorbs competition and taking storytelling mainstream. So just one example is the 1990s, as every studio bought up independent film companies, Disney bought the best one, the most successful one, Miramax, but then quickly fired its heads when they made Fahrenheit 9/11. And a film that was going to be too controversial because of its criticism of the U.S. government. They also acquired the biggest YouTube studio, Machinima, Pixar, Lucasfilms, and then, of course, Marvel Studios. Not that these weren't already mainstream companies, but Disney hugely expanded them, and in many ways, sanitized them. So what about Wakanda Forever? The film, as we know, picks and chooses from Mesoamerican culture to create an Atlantis like Namor and Talocan, and similarly, the culture of Wakanda is a mashup of African cultures. I've seen both criticism that it conflates all these cultures' histories into one kind of singular, non-distinct other, but also lots of critics who are excited to see elements of their own cultures represented, but which happens too rarely by a major studio. Audiences have loved it. The box office is incredible. Sort of curious to hear more about your thoughts. One kind of last little reading, kind of flat-footed but still compelling Marxist reading style is to say that all cultural works are allegories of their own production. And I was thinking, that's true. Who's Wakanda? What's Wakanda? Who's Wakanda? What are the allegories here? Maybe Wakanda is actually Marvel's representation of itself. Maybe Talocan is Star Wars, it's other Disney property, and what are they rebelling against? The Disney Empire. Yeah, so yeah, happy to hear about your thoughts.
Wow, thank you so much. I mean, there's so much to talk about. One thing I'm seeing is there's always that double nature to it. In all three of your contributions, there's some affordances, there's some things that we, a vision of Afrofuturism that we appreciate, but then it's always undercut by something. Was the undercutting due to the industry, the genre, the forms of storytelling that we have? I mean, if you relinquish the white gaze, but then what about the form itself as being from Disney? Can you ever really relinquish it? Ari's, your description of Chadwick Boseman being entrapped in the logo, that the metaphor of that, right? To actually be in those things that they come at you, they also shrink into nothing. That's that in a way. That's kind of really compelling, but it's like, sometimes I ask myself, like, is this for a child, or who is this movie for, to get a vision that will create something in their heart or send a kind of positive message, not undercut by the cynicism of the adult who goes, well, this is a corporate product here, Or, who is this for? And it's like, well, can we, I don't know how to pose this question except for maybe hear more about how can we, make peace with something that's always been perhaps tainted in some way. How can we extract the vibranium from it? No, I recall my thoughts. I mean, yes, you take anywhere in there.
I don't know, we all approach these kinds of movies with multiple kind of agendas, right? Like, say if I'm watching it, I don't know, I'm sure when it's released on Disney Plus, right? And I'm watching it, say it's Friday night, it's midnight. I'm in a different mood, maybe in my own privacy, or watching it in preparation for, a discussion like this, or watching it to teach it. Then I bring to bear a very different kind of critical eye and standard, right? Just in terms of how my own, a critical temperament mediates our viewing experience, and in what context, right? I mean, the thing that, I think about, for instance, aside the kind of speculative element, the way in which Haiti is represented, right? Because we end the film with a representation of Haiti that goes against how Haiti is represented even at this hour, if we were to turn on CNN, right? So there's it's not the Haiti as constantly in the new world, the locus of calamity, abjection, so on and so forth, right? It's a possibility, harking back to Haiti as the first Black republic, of potential and promise. And those scenes of Haiti are not using, special effects, none of that. So again, I think there's a way in which in this film, little gestures that try to undercut, right, like this double bind. And for me, the way in which it ends in Haiti. Again, compared to the first film where the pitting of African America and Africa Here you don't have that kind of binary mediating Africa and its diaspora, right? So my thing is within the constraints, there are these little gestures that are that kind of a possibility, right? But you know, commercial interests, convention, and genre have a way of undercutting.
Yeah, I love that reading it, and what you pointed out, Dan, about Haiti as very much becoming a sanctuary at the end, right? Where Shuri's finally, throughout the whole film, she's been struggling with her grief, and she's finally able to mourn. And it's a respite, right, after the whole tumultuous events of the film. And I think, JC, to kind of not answer your question, but also answer it at the same time, I hope. I think, you know, definitely going to the film, I have the criticism goggles on, because I was like, oh, I have to say something about this. And I did find the moment, and I wonder if you folks will remember this moment, and Lindsay has heard me talk about it endlessly, as the moment where I felt the kind of the dread of like, oh no, what is this film going to do? Of when the Talibans kind of quote unquote invade the ship, and we get that non-diegetic sound of like, through all the films we've watched, the media we consume, there's a kind of stereotypical racist battling, sped up drum beats. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That noise, the high pitched noises that also read distinctly as not only Orientalist, right, in one bend, but also quote unquote native, right, and tribal. And when those sounds started, and I saw blue skin and lots of gold, and specifically the kind of bend of one Taliban actor with the spear as they kind of like skulk and kind of hunt down the scientists. I was like, oh no, am I going to have a green inferno on my hands? I don't want that. I do not want that. And that was the kind of, I feel like the tension of the film for me was, I mean, and I'm currently teaching a class about like representation in the media. And so there's not just good and bad representation, right? There's more nuance than that. But the most horrifying moment in the film for me was definitely, and I think it's supposed to be horrifying, to your point, Dag, about the decentering of the white gaze, because we have the world is ending, beautiful like resources suddenly found at the bottom of the ocean. The white woman scientist, she's the savior, she's gonna save everything, right? And then we get like a horrifying moment where she shoots and screams at this Taliban person, actor, viciously, right? And that moment was a moment of distinct discomfort for me and horror, just because we just have the kind of skulking, the imagery of colonialism was being played out again, right? Of violence. And that was something that was definitely on my mind and weighed heavily on me throughout the rest of the film. And I couldn't help but be more critical after that, and really notice the way that especially the sound engineering tells us that Namor and the Taliban are supposed to be the enemy. Yeah, so I guess that makes the moments other moments more difficult to swallow, I guess. But also as far as like the good moments, it's, I don't know, a bit hard, right? I love that Afrofuturist scene where she's just like, I don't know, piloting with her drums. I'm like, that's awesome. Yeah.
So both your comments made me realize two things I hadn't thought about before. One is that we watched it with this critical gaze, and really JC and Becky ruined the movie for us.
I didn't know how I feel all the time since I've been teaching this stuff. Yeah.
But you know, another is actually about the Haiti scene, which is, you know, I wasn't thinking this being part of the film because it comes at the end after the credits, but it's a really important one. For the reasons you were saying, but it's an echo of the early scene in the movie where they're in Wakanda and they're in this kind of fantasy space, Shuri and mother, right, and everything's really unrealistic, and it's the kind of movie fantasy, and then you have an echo at the end where it's realistic and saying, take the kind of empowering world that they exist in and then bring that to the real world.
And I mean, for me, like there are things going to watch both films or anything about Africa made by an American production company. I have to like tamp down my expectation because, like for instance, accents. I thought actually the second one was better. The first one, we're in Wakanda, but that's a kind of Nigerian English, and then all of a sudden we shift to, given a cast of characters who speak different Englishes, right? So in terms of the kind of generic English accent, an African speaking in English, to me is really it's so charming. Right?
There's almost nothing more long-standing in Hollywood tradition than anyone who's not American has an English accent.
You completely,
Yeah.
And you can tell, like for instance, Angela Bassett, like just certain words she was using, it is as if she's trying to speak as a Xhosa speaker, like how she drags out certain vowels and syllables. And then there are others who this is just a generic African accent. So like going to these kinds of films, be it Coming to America or Black Panther, like I have to lower my expectations because I know, if my expectations are high, they're going to be not met and disappointment will kick in. So there are kind of forbearances in that sense. I think sometimes with these films, we're also projecting our own ideals, right? Like of the world we want to watch. I agree to your point of like why we want Afrofuturist films, right? And of a certain romantic vision of the continent, right? That and that romantic vision, I mean, there's certain scenes where I feel like, oh my God, this is taken straight out of tourism commission ads all over the continent, right? Like, so, yes, there are all these, what more to say, right?
There's so many, I mean, the language issue and accents is one of the ways in which we can just use that as a through line for so much of all the things that we're talking about. When did they choose to go to Wakanda and not? Why are they not speaking Wakanda in the most important statements of the funeral? And that's another version of the white gaze or the global audience. Like, oh, let's just use English for the most important stuff. And then, because the logic of why would you be speaking Wakanda at this moment? But then you get moments and you see where you have them speaking Creole in the truck, but that's no subtitle there. You gotta either know the stuff or you're just gonna be in a moment where you're like, oh, I guess they're speaking their language. Right? And you just don't know what they're saying. So when are they choosing to give us something or give just them? And the only one who addresses it is Neymar. He says they gave us a hateful language. And that's stated like a hateful language. And it's the only one who that's one of the things that has been absorbed by his kind of people. And he's got an interesting, I mean, as a reinvention of a character, wow, right? I mean, the guy so far from what it was in the original 1939 comics. So he's just
Tell us more about that. You mentioned
Yeah.
that. You mentioned an email. We haven't read the comments. So
Well, he was just like a sea captain called Mackenzie, married an Atlantean blue-skinned lady, and they had this child who became Namor the submariner, right? He was fighting Nazis at submarines, basically, in 1939. And he's not blue also because of the half-human aspect. And what's the origin story of Aquaman? It's the same one. It just it just became more popular later on. But I was struggling between being in awe of human creativity for having found a way to make Namor out of Namor the submariner, right? Or just like, what the hell? I mean, how are you gonna? Why have you imposed this to try to create the vibranium source on the African continent and the vibranium source in the American continent, right? But it's fascinating. I mean, that's why it made the film as already, as you said, so hateful at times about pitting these two peoples against each other. To me, the only way that big scene where they're fighting on the ocean as peoples and the two leaders are fighting on the desert as leaders the only way that was working, I thought that Contessa Valentina, L.A. Venice or Beat or Julia Louis-Dreyfus, was actually, while all these two populations were not protecting their homeland, they were extracting the resources. I thought that was the twist coming, that while the two peoples of color were battling each other, the CIA, and because that one of the things she says is like, oh, if I could just get my hands on all that, right? I thought that was the way to make the wastefulness of the two leaders needing all this time and all this death and all this violence to finally see eye to eye. That is when you distract. It's a true, tried and true, colonial tactic to pit the locals against each other so that you can go do your business. But they didn't do that. But on the flip side, there's a beautiful thing with T'Challa. Peter, you mentioned how the son is also made T'Challa, but he's also made Toussaint Louverture, right? So then now you've got that revolutionary leader, right? Who's kind of like the historical import of that. It's kind of like how embodied in Namor's historical de-aging, how he's, for me, one of the most touching moments I would say was how at the end he's painting the battle between Black Panther and himself, in the ancient kind of aesthetic style. And I was like, oh, that's just how he paints because he's 600 years old. But I thought that's kind of beautiful, and that he's able to still depict the history of his people in that way. Anyway, I'm going all over the place, but again, we keep on having to pick and choose, but I thought it was, I was surprised that there was no payoff to the contrived battle between the two people, right? Like, they're the ones with the resources. So, and there was no third act going there.
No, third act is they ultimately have an agreement and they're setting up the next movie. That's the third. That's the end of every year.
But it's an acquiescence.
You have to stop making
That's
Marvel
phase
movies.
five.
Phase five. Phase five. One thing we haven't talked about, I don't know if this, but it's we haven't talked about as much is gender and how compared to the first. But this is much more matriarchy. There's always the Doja, the warriors of Wakanda. And this was, I thought it was really striking. Angela Bassett's performance. It sounds like she even tried more than all the others at getting the language right too. Her performance is kind of amazing, right? What do we make of that? Because they made a choice, right? Ultimately, I've been reading some little articles, and they had to choose. Are we going to go with Baku, right, to become the next Black Panther? But no, we're going to make Shuri. And that's true in the comics too. Around 2005, they made her Black Panther for a while, when T'Challa kind of gets beat up a little bit, and he's got to take a break. But one thing I also thought they were going to do is the DNA of the heart-shaped flower comes from America, right? The American continent. I thought she's going to turn blue. Right? Like she eats the heart-shaped flower, or something's going to happen that's not quite what happened when the Wakanda blue-shaped heart-shaped flower. Like that was going to be a way of melding Talokan and Wakanda through the merging of this DNA, but they didn't go there either. I'm going to do it with phase 5. But what do we make of just having gone there? Let's do the truth. Let's have as one of you said, like a Black woman superhero for this one.
I think that's why, symbols matter, right? And we know, think about Shuri's character, and then from, who's the MIT? Riri's character, right? We know it's a profession, it's a profession from the kind of absence of not represent exactly, not just folk of color, but also specifically Black girls, Black women. So I'd imagine, I think about, for instance, if I were to take my 2 nieces, which I plan on doing, who are 7 and 6, to see that, I could be a scientist, I could be an engineer, I could be a coder, right? And these are the kinds of attachments we make at a young age by virtue of being corroborated what we see on this screen, right? So, and
And the
that's,
scientist too.
yeah.
The scientist. We must get the
Exactly.
scientist.
Yeah, my bad. Yes. The scientist, right? So it has its, limitations, but like it has this kind of symbolic currency that matters. You know, so in that sense, I was taken by that. And also in terms of, there's another way in which kind of Black women are guiding the film in terms of the soundtrack, right? You have the official soundtrack, but then there's another soundtrack that was released, kind of guided by Rihanna and Tennis, right? So that's then also a different way of commanding the film in a different way by Black women, right? So I feel it was an endeavor, an enterprise that foregrounded Black women and led by Black women, even outside of the film problem.
So that's exactly right. That the symbols matter, and also I'm thinking back to Henry Jenkins' book on the way people view content now, and he says, you thought The Matrix was a bad movie, it's because you only saw the 3 movies. That's a very small part of the universe of that, which you see it. There are also the animated shorts, but also there's the fan engagement. And obviously, if you only see Black Panther 1 and 2, you barely scratch the surface of the storytelling, of the culture. And if you would, especially I think the fan work is some of the most interesting. If you go to an archive of our own, one of the biggest archives of fan work, the MCU is the #1 most reworked franchise. More than Harry Potter, more than Star Wars, which are the second and third. And it's because the stories are boring. For me, it's because I actually don't even follow the larger universe. And partly what they're doing is just giving people fodder for their own imaginations to create their own stories. I just think about all the amazing characters and plots and material that they give kids who rework, and adults who can rework this through their own stories.
Yeah, I was unfortunately on Twitter. And I was looking at what
You pay for your verification?
absolutely not, not sense. I was on Twitter and I was looking at what the fan engagement was, and we've got many Namor and Shuri Shipper, unfortunately. But
Oh, like they're as a couple?
yes,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh, surprising, he's 600, but okay. But
They have
I
some moments together.
they were on screen. Yeah.
No ages.
No ageism, it's so true. And I think I wanted to talk about what you mentioned with the wastefulness too. Because part of that wastefulness that I felt was that a lot of the film felt very chopped up, strangely. And I wondered if, and eventually I was like, oh, it's because Riri is kind of shoehorned in here. And I was curious, but also kind of know the answer as to why Riri was here and introduced.
Peter, you can say, well, she's going to be introduced.
Exactly. And
Product placement.
exactly.
So
for the future.
Disney uses people rather than Coke bottles
Mhm.
in terms of product placement.
Yeah, and on purpose in the second Black Panther film, as opposed to any of the so many films that come out a year, right? And how it takes up maybe easily a third of the runtime of going to get Riri at MIT and then coming back. And she eventually doesn't really do anything. She flies around in the Ironhearts, which is cool.
Right. Yeah, she fights one of the 2 main henchmen of the
Yeah, she freezes someone or something, or catches him.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, but that's again, it's that double bind. Okay, I one of the most moving scenes are with Shuri, okay, and Riri in her dorm room.
Yeah.
And then with the Queen.
Yeah.
Saving the African American kid for posterity. Those are kind of great, but
Another thing on wastefulness and Angela Bassett wasted almost solely because she wasn't supposed to die in the film, but that she was talking to the director, being like, "Why am I dying? Like we already
You're
have."
gonna regret this.
Right. You're gonna regret my absolutely amazing performance. But and she was talking to the director, and he was like, "Oh, it's necessary." And you know, death is something that can be rewritten and then pulled back. No one really dies in Marvel, which is a very strange thing to say, especially when this film is about grief, right, and a very permanent death. And what really bothered me too was that post the Queen's death, when finally Shuri is allowed to grieve at the very end, we see obviously flashbacks and clips of her and Chadwick Boseman, of T'Challa. She's finally able to grieve him as an actor, but also as a brother in the film, right? We do not get a single shot of Angela Bassett. And that moment, I was like, oh, but speaking of wastefulness, speaking of not only the amazing ways that Black women kind of lead and take center stage in this film, but also the ways that, again, we're talking about the way, runtime goes too long, we have to cut stuff down, who are people in seats, who is this film for? Who would notice that, right? Yeah, all these questions also came up for me, but especially in that scene where Angela Bassett, the Queen, it just isn't there.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, pedestrian answers that we can still have her come in the visions of the ancestors, right? And she does come at a pivotal moment, right? Show him who you are. Right? It's like showing you kind of mercy, even though she's really savage and cuts his wing, man.
And kill him.
Yeah.
Makes it
Yes.
dead, but comes back for
That was kind of striking. I mean, it's a constraint, but they made it work for the story. They don't always manage to do it, like maybe in some of the Riri Williams scenes. Right? I know, like online people are complaining about her outfit, so you can tell that all the design guys for the Disney Plus series are like, okay, we're taking another thing. We designed this, make it cooler, not like Power Rangers. Well, you have a few minutes left.
Can I just quickly about the cast of characters, because I was, doing a little wiki stuff about not a Pan-African, almost, I don't want to call it fantasy, but so we have African-American actors, Guyanese British, Letitia Wright, Danny Guerra, American Zimbabwean, character plays Ayo, Ugandan German, Riri is Chini, African American. You have Michaela Cole, Ghanaian British. You have a Bayesian American, a Kenyan Mexican, and Lupita. And that's a different kind of. It doesn't make it itself in the narrative of the film, but in terms of the cast of characters, a really international and Pan-African ensemble. I can't think of another film that has that kind of range of all the expansiveness of what it means to be Black, right? And I think that is of the moment of where film culture is in that sense, right? To feature just a range of Black actors from the globe, right? I was taken by that.
I think it's reflected in the language too, right? We hear Spanish, French, we hear English, we hear Xhosa, right? All of those languages, which again is a reflection of the diaspora, especially with Lupita's character who speaks Spanish, English, and Wakanda. She's got it all. Yeah, any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you all for your presentation. I enjoyed the discussion. Professor Woubshet?
Yes.
Your earlier statement about counter-revolutionary really it keeps sticking with me. So, I used to teach in Chicago years ago, and I had a chance to talk with and meet Sam Green, who did The Spook Who Sat by the Door, which was out in theaters within 2 weeks. And he, said there would never be another revolutionary movie put out, in America. And is sticking with me as well. So, because I see this film as counter-revolutionary, just like the first one, particularly who they make the villain in both films. And what's particularly interesting to me, because the symbolism I think is important but symbolism has its limits, right? The CIA historically used culture to undermine African liberation movements, right? And isn't this film doing the same? When we think about what is it's almost saying what this is the way you make change, or it's putting a stamp of approval on how to change things. And it's saying Killmonger and Namor that they're outside the realm of what's possible or should be possible. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, it's a great point, and I agree with you. And it's I'll say, can Hollywood, like a big production made by Hollywood, couldn't even offer us a revolutionary vision, right? And also, I mean, just the CIA point, the irony that's kind of lost. Lumumba, one of the characters, is actually, in passing, is referred to as Lumumba. And we know it was the CIA who actually ended up getting Patrice Lumumba, right? So there are all these, but at this point, it's like quotation of revolutionary. It becomes, it's like, it's quotational, and it's not actually substantive articulations of what a revolution could be, right? I had another point I was going to say. The difference, though, is I think we're in a different era of Black visual cultural production, be it visual art, be it films. I think about the small screen, like some of the, like Colson Whitehead's adaptation of Underground Railroad. I find it incredibly powerful. Or
some of it gets canceled, it's true.
Or right, so or Atlanta, the sitcom Atlanta, or Queen Sugar, or we are in a different era, right? Of just a certain kind of autonomy, I think, that Black filmmakers have to represent kind of just the complexity of Black life that's not always determined by white audience expectations, right? So it may not be that kind of revolutionary possibility may not come from a big Hollywood production, but I think it is there in a range of Black visual culture that has become part of our diet in the last, 5, 6, 7 years, right? That would be my point.
Yeah.
Professor Woubshet, can I ask for like a bit of a clarification on your point about like the CIA agent being like a revision in the second movie? Because for me too, like in the first Black Panther movie, like he was definitely the most jarring feature of it. And for me, it's like it's upsetting where I guess like these white figures are used as comedic relief, and in a way making it one like more palatable for like a white audience, but also in a way excusing them. Another instance I think of is like in Infinity War, with that moment with like Hulk having that awkward bowing moment with T'Challa, right? In the reverse, that's an actually really scary moment for a lot of immigrants coming into America, right? Having the fear of the proper greeting. And then another instance is of comedic release is like our first introduction of Riri as a character is like she's doing homework for I believe either a white or like white passing person, where that person is going to be receiving a lot of credit for a person of color's work. For sure, it's like in the moment it's funny, it's like, oh yeah, she's receiving money, but there's so many like underlying damages in it. And then in this case, I think the CIA agent went even further in the fact that now he's kind of like a sympathetic ally figure. And I guess as soon as I left the theater, I was like, wow, this is like no different than when people argue like, oh, there are good cops. And that's kind of, I saw like a bit of clarification on what you mean by revision.
It's true. I was just pointing out the difference between the way that character's figured in the first film, right? And remember, we finish the first film, and there is real kind of solidarity between T'Challa and the CIA agent, right? In the second film, he's meaning maybe it's just bad script, but you don't have, it doesn't, I mean, think about it, a film ends and then ultimately the solidarity isn't between African Americans and Africans, it's between the CIA and the Kingdom of Wakanda. But in this film, it's not that, right? He's there and it's not resolved, it's not neatly tied up, but the emphasis isn't about the meeting of these two imperial powers, or an imperial power on the one hand and another mighty power on the other. So I'd imagine, given the kind of criticism that the film, the first one faced, these are like little tweaks. They're minor, they're tweaks, that's what, reworking minor tweaks might be a term, a phrase I would use, right? But I take your point, absolutely.
Yeah, and if I may, I think that's especially clear in even our entry point into both films. Like in the first one, Martin Freeman's character is definitely who the audience is, who the camera follows, right? Like he's our introduction into Wakanda. And in the second one, he's kind of peripheral. And we get to see Wakanda from the perspectives of the people who live there, right? And then again, JC, then I get questions about this is a monarchy, and then I keep going. But all of this to say, I think the tweaks is definitely there in the attempt to kind of decenter whiteness that happens. But that the really hyper militarization of not only Black Panther films, but also all of Marvel, really. And I don't know if JC or Peter, you have the answer to this about the conspiracy theory of Department of Defense funding part of Avengers or whatever, or how in some of the trailers or prior to the films coming up, we have the Marines ad to join the Marines or the Navy SEALs. Yeah.
Like Gun Maverick being a huge hit, but also advertising.
Exactly.
And to your question, Ari's to your point, it is true. Can revolutionary potential be found either in an imperial power or in a kingdom? It's not a republic, right? Wakanda is a kingdom, right? So that's the thing, the kind of alliance of ultimately kind of authoritarian power, right?
The big political change though between 1 and 2 is in the first film, they're very isolationist. And the decision they make in the end is to also be more interventionist. And this is what this film is about, what that looks like, how they engage other powers.
Yeah, it's a complex thing because Killmonger was also trained by the CIA, right? And there's that aspect of he's using the master's tools, right? That idea of okay, now I'm going to go and steal back ancient artifacts from the museum. That's how we're introduced to him, right? The first one, and then use that kind of knowledge that he's been trained that to kind of go against. But then you have to introduce the CIA guys because you can't have the audience hate the CIA for having trained this man, right? And all of that. But Bilbo, Martin Freeman, he's just injected in there as kind of total comic relief. It's the Contessa, who's now a kind of more problematic CIA figure, but they were formerly married. In the comics, she was with Nick Fury back in the day rather than Martin Freeman. But an interesting thing that you mentioned, Ari, that I didn't expect, if you read the introduction of Black Panther in the comics, his first appearance, it's in Fantastic Four. And it's through the Fantastic Four's ship, a ship that T'Challa donates to them. They're amazed by how it functions. How did they do this? And you get to introduce to Wakanda through them, so also through white characters that are kind of going in. But strangely enough, they also bring the Human Torch's roommate from college, whose name is Wyatt Wakefoot, and he's a Native American. There's no power, but he's there. And he's commenting on what's going on. So it's really complex and interesting in its own way, the origin. But thank you for making that point about how do we first see this world and this kingdom. And speaking of kingdom, there's that scene with Baku at the end. It looks like he's going to be challenging there's going to be a split now, maybe, right? There's going to be the Black Panther protector, but then the king's going to be someone else this time, right? For phase 5. Stay tuned, right? All right, thank you very much, everybody, for coming in.
I work with probably the same, and the